Hi, I'm Scrimshire and I am going to take you through another production walkthrough. This time we're going to look at the song Unforgotten, Unforgiven, which features Nat Birchall on saxophone. So it began on the roads, and in fact we can look at that. When I was looking back at this today to start taking you through it, I realised that this was written entirely one-handed on the right hand. And I think my thinking was at the time that I really wanted to try and simplify some of the compositional elements of how I was writing and declutter things a little bit. And especially with this, where it was almost nursery rhyme-like kind of atmosphere, I wanted some simplicity. I did still cluster some notes. I'm using quite tight kind of clusters with here. But yeah, it looks and sounds a little bit like this. What I moved on to after that was these bits down here. If we've called them FX in here, and let's have a little listen. Now, the album was a response to a political environment that we were experiencing in October last year. There was times when the news was coming at such quick succession about what was going on that you were just like, is this real? Is this real? And what I wanted to try and achieve throughout the album really was a kind of grizzling, niggling palette of chaotic sounds that undercurrent everything. And I started out with this one in particular and Unity Game, which we talked about before, using the ARP and the Prophet, and yeah, I moved on later to trying to work with VCV Rack, which is a kind of virtual modular synthesizer. And it's not supposed to necessarily be harmonically complementary. In fact, it's supposed to push against things in a lot of places throughout the album, and I toy with that kind of tension, and sometimes with other tracks actually moving into resolution with it as well. And then the biggest endeavour of all, probably with this particular song, was the drums. And I conceptually had a few ideas, basically to layer up a lot of different sounds on each drum pad. So there's the basic drum at the bottom, and then there's a number of cymbals. Now those are all off just one note there. Those are all related to this particular note. And my original idea was to layer those up and then use these elements, basically, which are programmable, to control where each of the samples would start. So to move this, essentially, around to create variation each time that it was played. So I would play the pattern through, and then I'd go through again, moving this up and down to adjust where the samples would start, to create different textures as it evolved. I really struggled to make that work, and sometimes I would commit to exploring those ideas, and it's something that I definitely want to go back to and work on in terms of creating really evolving drum kits. But in this case, what I ended up doing was doing that section as a kind of melodic drum pattern that complemented the chords, and then doing the really textured stuff separately. So in this case, let's go to a busier section. what I've been using here is a number of samples that I actually grabbed from Splice, and they are kind of Foley sound effects that would be used in film or TV, and they are the sounds of bullet shells being dropped on the floor. I mean, I was thinking a lot about refugees escaping crises across Europe, also obviously Ukrainian war, and these sounds I wanted to incorporate rather than using traditional percussion sounds. So again, throughout there are a number of different kind of sounds here that I then layered up and changed where they began and where they ended in order to get the percussion sounds that I was after. So those two. And then I panned them around the kind of soundscape in order to get that texture. And finally, we talked about it before, but I've been using addictive drums. Not their built-in patterns, but just the actual sounds themselves, and hand programming them, playing in using the Ableton push in order to get the kind of drum movement and dynamics that I'm after. So that's in as a separate cymbal track here. And that's my drum setup basically. I'm running it through some tape effects and some EQ. I was trying to get a very wobbly sound. Down here is the bass, played in, as I said, on the Moog Grandmother. A kind of classic, very kind of 70s influenced bass sound on this. This took a lot of work later on in the mix to try and make it balance with the tuning and tone within those drums that we were using. I mean, I worked really hard to tune the drums so that they would be consistent with the keys, so that we're all melodically working together and it was all harmonically kind of consistent. But still, there's a lot of frequency crossover when you've got really low drums like that and then bass like this. The bass took a little while for me to work out, actually. I wasn't sure about this descending pattern at first. I really liked it, but at the same time, I wondered if it was being too descriptive, if it was giving too much and not allowing you to kind of take from the sound what you would want to take from it. It was defining it a little bit too much. I do really like quite melodic bass lines, and I wonder sometimes if that's to the detriment of the songs. So the final element was to go back to the Moog, and I just wasn't getting quite enough weirdness and noise out of this this keyboard setup in here. So I took the chords and I replayed them because I wanted them to roll. I wanted them to kind of, you know, a note at a time rather than playing as a synchronized thing. So let's take out the other keys. But the magic, I think, really in here is actually in the processing. So let's look, there's these two tape emulations on this. The first, let's turn it back on, creates a huge amount of wow and flutter. I really wanted it to be wobbly and odd. And that deals with that. And then the second one over here, this is dealing with tape echo, tape delay, and spreading that out across the palette as well, left and right. And the final thing was to come through the precision here, which I really love, but there's one particular setting that I love on this. I think it's called All Around Your Head. And it just kind of pushes things back a little bit and out. And it's very subtle. I don't think you'd even be able to tell on this. And back in. Because things are moving so much in the rest of the track, I'm not sure you'll be able to tell, but it does make a difference when you're listening to it in the context of everything else. It just kind of moves it out into the space a little bit and allows everything else to be centered. So these were our key elements, really. And that's how it sat for a while, as I wondered what to do with it. But then I came to the excellent conclusion that I would really love to work with Nat Birchall again. And so I think in late December, just before I went away for Christmas, I sent this over to him and said, how about it? And he said yes. So let's go and take a look at the mix project, which is where I brought Nat's work into this for the first time. I'm not doing much on the actual individual tracks. There's so much done in the production part of it for me these days that I've kind of nailed a lot of the sound I'm after. So for me, this part of the mixing process is about small tweaks. It's about getting just that little bit extra out of it. And I personally find that the tools within Luna, particularly things like the tape that's kind of built into every track, the Neve summing up here, are all simulating traditional kind of mixing environment, specifically of hardware that have something very unique to them. So I come in along these lines. With the drums, I rolled off a fair amount of the low frequencies here and actually cut them off beneath 27 Hertz. Where we were talking about that before, how this was going to work in terms of the drums and the bass actually fitting up. So let's take a look. If we go to the drums here, and let's bring it along a little bit, and then introduce the bass. So again, I've rolled off even more of the drums here and just increased a little bit in the tops because of all those things like the gun shells and everything, just really trying to get them to step out over the top. Because I've gone for a very lo-fi sound across the board on this. There was only a couple of things that I wanted to sound really clear, and that was those shells and then Nat. The bass we've done loads on. We've boosted the bass up here, but used this classic kind of technique of attenuating a little bit as well at the same frequency. This Pultec emulation, this is a kind of classic trick with the particular bit of hardware where you boost and you cut at the same time, and it just creates a perfect curve really of, yeah, it's a sound. And I've cleared out a little bit more space at 200 Hertz here and just emphasized some of the higher elements of that synthesizer sound just to give it clarity as it's coming through. Yeah, I did a lot of work on this bass to get it to sit where I wanted it to. It was a challenge, I would say. More EQ. Sometimes, you know, it's great if you can get it with one plugin or one particular effect, but sometimes it's just a little bit at a time. And it doesn't necessarily hurt to use different layers of different sounding or non-sounding effects in order to get what you're after. So, you know, this Pultec does a very specific thing and sounds a very specific way, whereas the Pro Q is a lot more transparent in terms of that, and that does that job. I used some room reverb on the bass to just give it a bit more resonance and fill the space a little bit better. And then I love using this, but this boosts the low frequencies. This is kind of a rip-off of a more famous bass boosting piece of hardware. And then finally, just really controlling some of the peaky bits of this bass to make sure it's sat comfortably. Let's bring in those keys. They're a lot louder in this than they were when we did the original production. That's guitars. Oh, we've got the Moog coming in there, and I've added more of, well, on both the keys and that. I'm using this precision reflection engine again, because it just does, for something like this where I'm just trying to create spaces, it's great. And what I was really trying to do here was to give Nat space, so to push everything out to the sides a little bit and just back, carve this sort of theatre of space for Nat to sit beautifully in the middle. So let's look at Nat now. This was his whole piece. I did take out an early section. I could play it to you, in fact. Let's have a listen. Let's unmute that. It's really hard to make decisions to cut people's performances. And it's not that I didn't like that at all. I love that. I really do love that. But it felt to me that it was not giving us the time to feel, and also in the context of where it was going to come in the album, it's coming after something quite intense. And so a moment's breath before the power of what Nat was about to communicate, it felt to me that leaving this space empty for this beautiful sonorous entrance here. Just as we go into the chord change. At first it felt quite bizarre to come in as we're going into a different passage, but I love it now. I'm really glad that we made that decision. And I just left a little bit more space here. The only other cut I made in Nat's work. Again, let's have a listen. That was a harder decision to make in some ways. It's beautiful and it flows obviously straight out of what's come on, and more importantly it actually builds up and makes sense of where this goes next when we reach to this. So I took the risk on removing that and not having that passage that gets us to that point. But as I listened to it, I felt that this such a beautiful melody and felt natural coming on its own like that, that we could again have that moment's breath and then continue with what is then a really significant performance from Nat all the way through. But that's it, my friends. You can see these cuts at the end, and this is about just album running management, really. I really wanted this to, well, there's another track that's going to come and I'll show you about it later. It started out as being one track and it ended up being two tracks. And one night I had this moment of realizing in my head that the two songs could really blend with a slight transposition in the second track. So I took elements of this and put them into the other track, and then I knew I needed to extend this one in order to get it to blend in the way I wanted it to, but also to be releasable as a single with a definitive kind of ending that wouldn't sound too weird. So I did this section at the end where I looped and filtered with the bass. And that leads nicely into the following track. But that is it. That is Unforgotten, Unforgiven featuring Nat Birchall. I hope that was insightful, a little bit of detail about how that came together. And yeah, that's available to stream, download now, or you can buy it on the LP Paroxysm, which is out on May 26th, but it's available to pre-order. But thank you very much for listening to me waffle on about all this stuff. It's nice to go through it, and I hope you find it interesting. More to come. As always, drop me any questions, things you want to know about it, anything that I can help you understand in more detail. I'm always happy to chat about it. So yeah, thanks.